earlier I talked about how large language models are a subset of all the foundation models out there. So it sounds like, for that kind of medical application, unless it also needs to have vision to be able to read, cancer scans, but let's just assume that it sounded like that initial application was just going to be natural language in and out of the foundation model. So in that case, we could be like, okay, I can use a large language model. How do you choose, so maybe it's kind of vaguely you're within the space of all the possible foundation models you could select. There might be some kind of things like that where you can say, okay, if I want text in and text out, I want an LLM. But more specifically, how do you choose from all of the available foundation models out there? So within the category of LLMs, there's thousands of possible options out there. How do you pick the right one for your application?
Absolutely right, John. So interesting how we're so spoiled for choice now, even though two and a half years ago there was no such thing, right? Even 2 years ago there was no such thing as or just starting foundation models, LLMs, and so on. Now there's thousands, as you said. Well, there's a lot of factors, and we're going to highlight 12. You don't need to remember them off by heart, but like see which ones you um, relate to as a listener, which ones you relate to the most, which ones will be most important for your business. So the first factor that you probably need to think about is cost, because there is a cost associated with using these models, and they have different pricing. So you want to look at that as a starting point. Then there's modality, which John, you alluded to. Whether what kind of data are we talking about? Are we talking about text data, video data, image data, and so on? So what outputs, what inputs do you want? What outputs do you want? Things like that. So different models are designed for different things. You need to check that one off right away as well. Customization options. So we'll talk about customization further down in this session. You need to be, once you're aware of the customization options, once we've talked about them, you will know which ones you would need for your business, and then you would look at which one does the foundation model offer. It's support. Inference options. Inference is basically once you've deployed the model. So there's training, which the first 3 steps, and then there's fine tuning, which is also considered training. But then there's inference. Once you've deployed the model, how is it used? Like, is it used right away, instantly? Like if you're developing a gaming application, you want a foundation model to be integrated in your real-time game where users are playing with each other, for some user experience thing. You want it to be producing outputs right away. There cannot be even like a second delay. So that's one option. Then there's maybe asynchronous inference, where you give the model some data, and then it gives you an answer back in 5 minutes. And maybe there's like a batch transformation, where it's done in the background later on. So we'll talk more about that in this session as well. Basically, you need to be aware of inference options that are relevant to your use case. Latency. Generally speaking, it's kind of tied in with inference options, but basically, like, what's the delay that the users will get, and that how the model responds, how quickly it responds. Yeah.
If with latency, if you want to be speaking in real time to the foundation model, it would need to have very low latency so that it feels like a natural conversation, for example.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. Architecture, it's a bit more advanced. In some cases, you might need knowledge about the underlying architecture, because that will affect how you're customizing the model, or what performance you can get out of it. Usually, that's a more technical consideration for more technical users. Performance benchmarks. So these models, there's lots of scoreboards. Ed Donner was on the episode like a few episodes ago, and he was talking about
847.
He was talking a lot about leaderboards. What did he say? He's a leaderboard. I laughed at that.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah, so there's lots of leaderboards, and there's lots of benchmarks that these models are compared against, even before you customize them. We're not talking about your evaluation of the fine-tuned or customized model. We're talking about the evaluation of that cake, that bottom layer of the cake. Even they have their own evaluations. How well do they perform on general language and general image tasks and things like that? So you might want to consider those. So you might want really high performance, but that's going to cost you a lot of money. You might be okay in your use case with average performance, because it's not business critical, or it's not you don't need that super high level of accuracy. Then you might be able to get a cheaper model, because you don't not requiring this super high accuracy. You also need to consider language. If you're using a language model, what languages does it support, like human languages? the size and complexity. Also, how many parameters. Small language models are becoming more popular these days. Can you use a small language model? Do you need to use a large language model? There's another consideration. It's a bit more technical as well. The ability to scale a model, that's an important consideration that probably, I would imagine, business users that are not like technically savvy might overlook. And that basically means, okay, you will deploy a model now and you can use it for your 10,000 users. But what if your business grows to 100,000? How are you going to scale it? Are you going to scale it by spending more money? Are you going to on the size of the underlying server, or is there a way to scale it by fine tuning it and changing the underlying architecture somehow? And that's a very technical consideration, but it can be like a bottleneck for growth for businesses. And the final two are, last but not least, compliance and licensing agreements. Very important as well. Like in certain jurisdictions, there are certain compliance requirements for data or how data is processed, or even AI. There's more and more regulations coming out around AI. And licensing, of course, these models come with licenses. How are you going to use them? Make sure that is aligned with the license that you're getting from the provider. And the final consideration is environmental considerations. Like it might sound strange, but if you think about it, these models, to pre-train them, there's a lot of computers required, a lot of energy is used up training these models. So you might want to look into, okay, well, am I supporting an organization that is environmentally conscious? Are they using the right chips? But we'll have some comments on chips later down in the course. Are they even inference of this model? Is this model efficient during inference? Am I going to be using a lot of electricity or not as much electricity as I could be with another model? So there you go. Those are the 12 considerations that maybe not all of them are applicable in your business, your use case, but those are the main ones that businesses tend to look out for when selecting a foundation model.
Thanks, Kirill. At the end there, you let slip again later on in this course, because I think you've been recording so many courses lately. But yeah, later in this episode, in fact, we'll be talking about chips. And yeah, so to recap those 12 criteria for foundation model selection, you had cost, modality, customization, inference options, latency, architecture, performance benchmarks, language, size and complexity, ability to scale, compliance and licensing agreements, and finally the environmental considerations at the end. There's a ton there. Adlan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, and particularly if there's, some way across all of these dimensions. I mean, like, where do you start? How do you start to narrow down the world? I mean, I feel like now that I know these 12 criteria for making selections, I feel like I'm even more lost in the woods than before.
Yeah, that's right. I was feeling the same at first when I was starting and building a new application of generative AI, and I had to pick a foundation model. In my experience, it had a lot to do with the dataset format. Because different foundation models expect different dataset formats, especially when you fine tune them. So, for example, I'll tell you about my recent experience. I did another fine tuning experiment. I think it was on one of the Amazon Titan models. Yes, so it's one of the foundation models by Amazon, which, by the way, just released their brand new foundation models called Nova. So I can't wait to test them out. But yes, at the time, I chose the Amazon Titan foundation models because the data set that I used to augment, once again, the knowledge of the foundation model was fitting perfectly to the Amazon Titan model. So I chose this one. It could have been a different one if it was a different dataset format. But yes, it really depends on the experiment that you're working on. It depends on the goal. So that's kind of extra criteria that you need to take into account. And when I created this chatbot doctor, this time, yes, as I said before, it was a llama model. And I chose this one once again for a format, concern. So yeah, in my experience, on a practical experience, it will have a lot to do with the data set that you're using to augment the knowledge or to do fine tuning or even RAG, which we will talk about later in this episode.
Yeah, and this will sound like I'm giving you guys a boost, and I am giving you guys a boost, but I'm not doing it just because of this. But this kind of difficult decision, trying to figure out what kind of foundation model you should be using, making that selection effectively could depend a lot on people like you, the two of you, who are staying abreast of all the latest in foundation models. And so it's the perfect kind of opportunity to be working with your new company with Bravo Tech to be able to, that 3 hours, for example, that you were offering up front at the top of the episode, a lot of that could be spent on just figuring out what kind of foundation model to be using for this particular use case.
Definitely.
Fantastic. Yeah. Thanks, John.